Thank you, Dr. Sanders, for doing this interview with us. We're so excited to have you for Pride at Phillips. And in this interview, I really wanted to take a deep dive into the topic that you yourself came up with for Pride, which is recovering absent pasts, repairing foreclosed futures, queer stories for survival. So first, what inspired this topic?
Yeah, well, thanks for talking with me about this and for having me at Phillips. I can't wait to be there with you soon. This is a topic I've been thinking about and working on for really a long time, and it's taken a lot of different forms over the course of the last decade or more. My practice and scholarship of pastoral theology, care, and counseling is really rooted in the narrative framework. So I'm really attentive to the ways that stories construct our sense of self and who we are in relation to others, who we are in relation to an ultimate context or God, and how those stories can be operated upon violently, that in ways that, for example, create spiritual stress, spiritual violence, religious harm and trauma, and things of that nature. And I've done a lot of research around LGBTQ suicide and the ways certain religious spiritual narratives can become constitutive of a sense of self leading to suicide attempt, and then looking at how LGBTQ people work with those narratives in the aftermath of surviving in order to live and reconstruct spiritual religious lives toward surviving and thriving in their life. But lately, I've been looking more at the ways that queer and trans people become cut off from the narratives of our ancestors, these stories that belong to us, the kind of narrative arc into which our individual narrative should be able to fit. But when we come into the world, often believing that we're the only one, and often born into families of mostly straight and cisgender people, going to churches of mostly straight and cisgender people, we don't have those stories of our trans and queer ancestors passed down to us, which can be a really stressful way of coming into our own sense of self-awareness, being disconnected from those pasts and those historical narratives that we belong to and that should belong to us.
Wow, you said this has been a decade-long venture for you that this idea of story and its impact on queer, you know, inspiration and kind of looking toward the future.
Yeah, probably actually more than a decade. It's been more like 15 years or so. I think I started to think about these kinds of questions somewhere around maybe 20, yeah, maybe 2010 or so. Some of the work that I've done on narratives around LGBTQIA suicide have been published in a variety of places. One of them is a book called Christianity, LGBTQ Suicide, and the Souls of Queer Folk. But in the last couple of years, that's when I've been turning to these larger historic narratives, and wanting to help queer and trans people, but also just communities of faith more broadly, to recover the stories of queer and trans ancestors. To address what a colleague of mine, Keith Manhennick, and I have called the chronostress of coming into the world detached from, severed from our historic narratives of queer and trans ancestors, and to repair the ways in which the future can become foreclosed for many queer and trans people when there doesn't seem to be a next narrative move in our life. And one of the pieces around that I think has been really helpful in the last couple of years when I'm speaking to churches or community groups or LGBTQ clergy about these things is to tell the stories of queer and trans ancestors that we largely don't know. These are stories of bravery, of courage, of resilience, of resistance to violence. They're stories of beauty and love and joy. And when we can put our lives back together again with these narratives, I'm finding this to be a real source of strength and resilience and resistance to the forces that try to cut us off from these narratives. We can look at this on a larger socio-political level and see the ways that, for example, even at the local school board level, all the way up to state levels, the policy and practice and even legislation that is being proposed and passed to cut children and youth off from the stories of queer and trans people. This is a form of what I think of as epistemic violence. It's this kind of violence that tampers with our knowledge when we don't have access to the stories that belong to us. But opening up those potentials, those stories for people to re-engage, I think does facilitate this kind of resilience and resistance to that type of epistemic violence. And we need that now, I think, more than ever. We are living in an era when our queer and trans lives, and especially the lives of our trans siblings, are under increased attack. And I think churches, especially churches that have made commitments of affirmation for LGBTQ people, need to be places where our stories are alive and told and our histories are celebrated. So when I come to Phillips, I'm going to tell some of those stories. And almost everywhere I go, when I tell these stories of queer and trans ancestors, and I ask, even in a room full of queer and trans people, I ask who's heard these stories before. There's usually no more than one or two people in any room that's ever heard these stories. And it's an incredible gift, I think, to receive these stories of our ancestors and to let them live in us and help us to live differently in light of them.
Yeah, wow, this is so powerful because I've even for myself as, someone who's in journalism, who's, looking at the news and telling and sharing story, I think that there is something so powerful and transformative when it comes to storytelling. And as an African American woman, it wasn't until university that I discovered a lot of my ancestry, all the things that have been hidden, removed, burned. And it's been both encouraging, but also extremely painful in some ways that there's this disconnect with my history that, there's ways that I feel like there's a disconnect with my inspiration, with my motivation, and I'm having to kind of piece certain things together. And so I'm so inspired by this, and I really can't wait to hear it and for people to be amazed because when I share the stories that I learned in university with people from, within my culture, it's interesting to see their light bulb, go off. That, there were tons of people, tons of my ancestors who've contributed so much to the world around us, and yet people know so little. And that in itself is so
Yeah.
striking that it's a constant mission, of mine. And so I just love that this is, your work right now. And over the past 15 plus years, I guess I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you start to tell these stories in various settings with different people, more stories emerge. People know stories about queer and trans ancestors that haven't been told that then they start to tell, and it enriches the whole tapestry of our narrative, communal life as queer and trans people. I remember telling a story not too long ago in a congregation about, I won't tell the whole story right now, but it was a story about some really radical and beautiful, faithful action somewhere else in the country. And I had no idea that there was any connection to it in the city where I was telling the story. And afterwards, a couple of elderly women came up and said, I know the person who was involved in that story. And here are two or three details you didn't know about that I can tell you to add to this story. And it's really just a really rich, beautiful way in which these stories can grow and flourish. And now my telling of that story is changed because I told it in that place. And those people could add something to the story that I didn't have access to. And yeah, it's just a really fun process too
It's beautiful.
to tell stories about our ancestors.
Yeah. So as I was kind of looking into your statement and this topic, I thought the wording repair foreclosed futures was really striking to me. And so I was wondering if you kind of unpack what you meant, by that.
Yeah. I started thinking about this notion of foreclosed future, or what some narrative theorists call narrative foreclosure, when I was interviewing LGBTQ people who had had suicide attempts, and I was looking at the ways that their individual narratives intersected with their religious and spiritual and theological narratives in ways that enacted a kind of violence upon their sense of self or soul, so that it seemed as if there was no more future for them to be lived. And that kind of narrative foreclosure is a part of what led to their suicide attempts. And in surviving those attempts, and in re engaging the religious and spiritual and theological narratives in resistance to that violence, in ways that sort of transgressed the status quo of those religious and spiritual narratives, their future was able to open up a bit, and their narrative foreclosure then sort of dissipated, and they had some life, a next narrative move to make in their life. And those stories were really beautiful and inspiring to me. There's not a week that goes by that I don't think about something in related to the stories of the people that I interviewed in that research. So I think the notion of resisting narrative foreclosure is helping people to see possibilities for a future that are intimately related to the past. I mean, I think sometimes it's the narratives of our queer and trans ancestors that can open up possibilities for our future. There's not a clear linear way in which I think the chronology of narrative necessarily works here. The narratives of the past become fuel for imagination of possible future narratives. So, yeah, the resisting of narrative foreclosure is the resisting of the violent narrative moves that try to foreclose futures for queer and trans people, that often lead to us fragmenting as communities, not finding one another. I mean, even I can think of, like, back in my college days, I went to a school where there's just really no talk about LGBTQ stuff at all, and even silence, which you wouldn't think of as a narrative tool, but it can be a real tool of violence. Even silence kept queer people from finding each other there. And it was after graduating when 4 or 5 of my close friends all came out. And there was no overt spiritually violent narratives or anti-LGBTQ narratives going on there. It was just the silence keeping us from one another. Another way in which stories and knowing who we are in relation to our ancestors can open up possibilities for the present and future. So all that kind of work, I think, opens futures that we don't know are possible yet.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you for explaining that. I think that kind of gives more context to, that idea of repairing foreclosed futures. And I think I really love the idea of repairing. Like, I think that that is something that is so beautiful and makes us and reminds us, like, there's a human aspect to this that still has a future, that still has possibility. And I think through story, we can shape, we can form, we can mold. Like, we have that power to mold and to shape um, with the collective as a whole. And I think, like you were saying, like with silence, like that can be both good and bad in some ways, in some contexts. And I think this idea of repairing is really inspiring. Yeah,
I hope it'll be
good.
helpful.
Yeah, I think it really will. I sometimes I overspeak for things. That's just the optimism in me, but I am so encouraged that these stories will be so helpful for um, both queer and trans people, but also those of us who engage in that community, and I think it'll help to provide more context and understanding with that particular community. Which kind of leads me to our last bit here about what are you hoping? Because you're on both ends, here where you're helping a lot of us who are in spiritual care. What insights or responsibilities do you hope that faith leaders and ministry communities take from this topic and from the conversation as a whole?
Yeah, I think for faith communities and religious spiritual leaders, I hope a big takeaway from this lecture will be that part of engaging in really good spiritual care for LGBTQIA people is helping to keep our narratives circulating, telling the stories of queer and trans people, because for the most part, queer and trans people sort of have to go looking for the stories of our people, our ancestors. They don't just come to us. Our families usually don't know them. Our churches often don't know them. We don't necessarily have early queer community that can pass them down to us. So it can be a really critical role of a faith community to infuse the narratives that circulate in that community with queer and trans stories of faith. Those are queer and trans people's stories, but those are also the church's story more broadly. They belong to the larger narrative of the faith tradition that we practice. I think another piece of this, because I know that there'll be a lot of queer and trans people in the audience too at Phillips, then I want queer and trans people to hear stories that they are proud to be connected to in some way. Some of the stories I want to share will be stories of real, just deep courage and bravery that I think can inspire our own courage and bravery in a time when things are becoming really precarious in the socio-political sphere. Other stories will be stories that will be hard to hear, stories of pain and violence, but ones that belong to us. They're people in our history that need to be remembered in the sense of memory, but also need to be remembered, re-membered, in that their stories and lives need to be put back together with ours. Because though they are gone, they belong to us and we belong to them. So I hope that this will be sustaining for queer and trans people who come to the lecture too.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, we have our marching orders. Um, is there anything additional that you would like, to add for people who are coming to the lecture and in anticipation?
Um, Nothing specific. I guess I just speak again my words of gratitude for having me at Phillips and my gratitude for Phillips Theological Seminary creating a lecture like this that foregrounds the lives and the faith of LGBTQIA people. You're doing work as a seminary that is so critical, and I'm really proud to have my story linked up with yours in this way. I'm really grateful for this invitation and can't wait to be there with you.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great. Yeah, we can't wait to have you.